You join us today for our Lunch and Learn session. I'm Amanda, and I work in the public sector team at CX Partners and Sopra Steria Next. So while we're still waiting for people to hop on the call, I'll just start to introduce the session and what our Lunch and Learn series is all about. And we'll kick off in a few minutes. So if you've not went to one of these before, the purpose of the series is to offer a program of learning so that we can all share some of our team's knowledge and expertise with you all. We run these sessions every month and we're always after feedback. So please get in touch with the marketing team who organize these sessions on marketing@cxpartners.co.uk. Let us know if the time works well for you, if you like the format, and if there are any particular topics that you would like to see us cover in the future. And I'll drop that, we'll drop that email address in the chat at the end of the session. And again, reiterate our call for feedback. This month's session is all about prototyping and how we think it's time to change your approach to them. I'll hand over in a minute to Chloe and Sam, who are our speakers today. But first, I wanted to flag that if you would like to turn on closed captions, you can find that in the bottom left-hand corner. And that for the Q&A, we will be doing that at the end, and we will be using Slido, which you should be able to see at the bottom right of your screen. Finally, before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this is a one-way webinar, so no one can see you or hear you, and we won't be enabling video or direct chat. So all questions through the Slido panel, please. So feel free to eat your lunch without the fear that anyone can see you. And again, we encourage you to ask questions in context. So if something pops up that you want to ask, please pop it in the Slido, and we will be keeping track of those. And I'll be chairing a questions and answer session at the end of the session. So we'll get started in about 1 minute, and then I'll hand over to Chloe and Sam. Welcome, everyone. You've joined our prototyping lunch and learn. Welcome to anyone who's joined us in the last few minutes. We are just about to kick off our lunch and learn session about prototyping. Okay, Chloe and Sam, I'm going to let you get started so we have plenty of time for questions at the end. So let me introduce Chloe and Sam.
Thanks, Amanda. So yeah, hi everyone. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn. The title of our Lunch and Learn, like Amanda said, is It's Time to Rethink Your Approach to Prototyping. And actually this was a talk that Sam and I were supposed to be doing at the Service Design in Government conference a few months ago, actually almost, yeah, at the end of September. We didn't get to do it because of illness, so we're actually really excited to be doing it today as a Lunch and Learn. And to a wider audience as well. So if you're joining us from Service Design and Government, then welcome. But also if you didn't, then it's nice to have you here too. Oh, let me see how this works. There we go. So first of all, let's introduce ourselves. So I'm Chloe, I'm a service designer, and my main specialisms are really in AI, innovation, and then also inclusion and accessibility. And what this really means is basically that I'm just particularly interested in designing with the future in mind, but also ensuring that services have a really positive social impact. Sam, do you want to quickly introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Sam. I'm a user experience designer. I've got just over 10 years experience kind of practicing across a number of different organizations in kind of different shapes and sizes, from kind of big corporates to startups. I'm a designer by trade, and just really passionate about using user-centered design, and particularly leaning on prototyping to help us actually solve some of the biggest challenges that we face right now.
Cool, thanks, Sam. So Sam and I both work at CX Partners, which is the research and design consultancy team within Sopra Steria Next. And for those of you who haven't heard of CX Partners before, or who don't know really who we are, basically what we do is we just work across the public and private sector, helping organizations to put people first through user-centered design. So that could be anything from user research, UX design, or strategy work. And we've been doing this for 20 years. Not personally, I haven't been doing it for 20 years, but the CX Partners has been. Okay, so let's move on to a bit of an agenda. So in today's talk, what we really want to do is just to encourage everyone to think creatively about the way that we prototype and how we can prototype ideas in new ways. So I think ultimately at the end of this, we just want everyone to walk away from this feeling excited to do more prototyping in their projects. So to start off, we're going to reflect on the state of prototyping today and how many people currently approach prototyping. And then we're going to strip it right back to the basics, and Sam and I will present the way that we think that we can rethink prototyping. Then to bring this to life, we're going to run through some examples of how we can rethink prototyping. But instead of running through a whole list, which at lunchtime, when we've got when we've got the budget coming out and everything, instead of running through that, we're going to think about some of the problems that we face or the excuses that we hear when we want to prototype, and how by rethinking our approach to prototyping, we can overcome this. We'll wrap things up by reflecting on some general principles as well to implement that help us to prototype with impact, and then we'll try and leave as much time as possible to hear from you. So we'll have a little questions and discussion thing at the end. If you have any questions or anything, like Amanda said, just post that into the Slido chat that you can see. So Sam, I'll pass over to you.
Nice. So yeah, let's start then with figuring out where we are with prototyping right now, and actually what we even mean when we say prototyping. So I guess as designers, it's probably safe to say that we recognise prototyping really as a key tool in our toolkit, but we fear in kind of recent times perhaps it's lost some of its spark and perhaps not creating the impact that it once did. Most recently, we've seen the rise of design systems and other high fidelity design tools, and generally kind of a desire to really feel like progress is being made fast. And what those things can kind of then lead to is this tendency to often just jump straight into something at this level of fidelity. And although using these tools will often mean that things do come together quite quickly, and let's not forget, that's clearly one of the advantages of prototyping. But what it can mean is that things can appear quite polished and quite thought through. And what that can then ultimately lead to is conversations that end up kind of zooming in on those tiny details. And rather than kind of giving space to explore the concept kind of more broadly as a whole. I think it's important as well to recognise though that prototyping is seen as a point often in a project where things actually just kind of start to come together, because something's been made, right? Something's become tangible, and often it's come at a point where it's just started to make some sense of a lot of conversation that's gone back and forth. And so we believe that, yeah, the potential for prototyping is huge. And if we were to just look at a dictionary definition for prototyping, we'd find something along the lines of a first or early version of a device or thing, which other forms are then developed from. And I think it's really worth emphasizing the part where other forms are developed, because I think that is where the kind of the trick, if you like, with prototyping is, and that's one of the things that we can do to make sure that prototyping remains a well-used and well-respected tool in our toolkit. So when you think of a prototype, what's the first thing that comes to mind? And perhaps, if you like, you might like to drop it in the chat in Slido. But actually, Chloe was at Service Design in government a couple of weeks back, and we were actually able to pose this exact question.
Yeah, so at SD and Gov, or Service Design in Government, we had some really lovely chats with people about what prototyping was and how we can rethink our approach to prototyping. You might be able to see some of them on your screen just now. I'll just run through some of them. So when thinking about what comes to mind when thinking about a prototype, we've got a few post-it notes about Figma, sketching, testing ideas and getting feedback. And then if we look at the board, which has how might we rethink our approach to prototyping, there's some really, really nice ideas in there. So there's one about involving the whole team or even users in prototyping, which is something that was we spoke about quite a lot. And yeah, there's some really nice ideas which we're going to run through and actually link back to in the rest of this talk.
So let's start then with what is likely to be one of the most common forms of prototypes, which is paper prototypes. And I guess, yeah, as I mentioned a second ago, words and conversations used to describe new features or experiences, they often take real time, they go back and forth, and often are just actually at risk of being open to interpretation. And so this kind of simple act of just sketching something out on a piece of paper instantly helps to create a shared understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and can just be incredibly powerful actually at various points throughout the end-to-end design process. And they come in, yeah, lots of different shapes and sizes. The second example, dialing the fidelity up a little then, is clickable prototypes. And again, these can be really useful at kind of helping test a more refined idea. They can help to really kind of communicate a particular interaction concept to the wider project team, or even to put in front of your users and see how that resonates with them. But both of these prototypes, you probably expect to see a lot in alpha and often in beta. If you're not so familiar with alpha and beta, I guess we're kind of specifically referring to the relatively early stages within a project, perhaps when a project has moved from research and into design. And typically, the two prototype examples we've just shown, you'd probably expect to have been created by somebody with designer in their job title. And I guess it's these 2 points that we've been wondering whether an opportunity exists for us to rethink our approach to prototyping. And so, what if we asked ourselves the question then, how might we rethink our approach to prototyping? Could it be a different form to this kind of digital clickable thing that perhaps we've got used to? What if you prototyped at different points within that end-to-end design and delivery process? And how could it be done by someone who doesn't have designer in their job title? We think that we can address each of these questions if you think about prototyping a little bit more like a mindset that you can put into practice at any point and in a number of different ways.
So yeah, so like Sam was saying, so seeing prototyping as a mindset as rather than a task is really going from, yeah, it's just seeing it as a learning tool really. So we want people to learn quickly and use prototypes to keep curious. Prototyping really should be creating something quick and dirty so that you can see what works, get buy-in or de-risk things. And at the moment, when prototyping is seen as a task, prototypes are seen too much like an output rather than what they were originally intended for. I think when we look at prototyping now, we see it as something that's used to scale ideas up and to build upon to get us to this final polished design. But it actually puts teams in a trap of seeing prototyping as this fixed task that sits in those particular places in the product when you create a product. I think ultimately what we need to remember is that prototypes weren't meant to stick, or they're not meant to stick. They're meant to test ideas. So if you think that anyone can prototype in any stage and in any way, when you start to look at prototyping in this way, the impact that it has is really quite big. So for the team, it becomes an exercise that binds everyone together and it aligns people. And by making them quick and dirty, what you're doing is you're making it easier for anyone to make a prototype. So you're encouraging collaboration. And it also breaks through that anxiety of prototyping an idea for the first time if you make it quick and dirty. So the team is just really encouraged to share and test their ideas more, which is a really healthy team culture. But it also, another impact is on the quality of the thing that you're making. So if you're having this testing mindset, it keeps people really open-minded and ideas more open as well. So you can really find the right idea that will solve the problem. So you're focused on the quality of the outcomes you're creating rather than the prototype being the output itself. Prototyping as a mindset, I think a lot of that seems quite maybe theoretical. And we've talked about it being quick and dirty and thinking outside the box, but we really wanted to bring this to life a little bit and think about what this looks like in practice. And like I said earlier, at this point, Sam and I could reel off a whole list of creative ways to prototype, but that could be quite monotonous. So instead, we thought we'd look at the problems that people face when prototyping or the excuses that you might hear when prototyping and how we can sort of bust these myths. So let's get to it. So we were reflecting, and I think these are the excuses that we hear the most and that we're going to be running through. So we often hear that there might not be time or the budget for prototyping. It might not be something that people think can be prototyped, or perhaps people feel like they already know all the answers. So those are a quick run through of the 4 excuses that we're going to go through, and we'll go through each one and how, by rethinking your approach to prototyping, we can try to overcome these excuses.
So that first excuse then, we don't have enough time. Perhaps you have an immovable deadline that's been set by a new piece of regulation that's coming in. Perhaps you're up against it with a shift to a new technology provider, or perhaps it's just a self-imposed deadline where you just want to get something done by the end of the week. We're sure that each of these kind of probably resonate with you at some level, and it's probably fair to say that it just always feels like there isn't enough time to get the job done. So if you hear this excuse, we want to be able to show that you do still have enough time to prototype. And so starting with what may seem like a really obvious one, you can simply just write some things down on a sheet of paper. When we were previously working with a financial services organization, we found ourselves in this place where they were particularly squeezed for time. They were up against it with this tight deadline enforced by the regulator to help them place more focus on the needs of their most vulnerable customers. But we had some doubts about the direction in which they were heading for this user group. But we needed to be able to back up our concerns with some evidence to be able to articulate them back to the organisation really clearly to help them course correct. And so by simply writing down the content on a sheet of paper, it enabled us to quickly sense check that with people to make sure that it was easy to comprehend. And just because you're simply writing things down on paper, this absolutely still means that you're creating a prototype, and we believe that this is something that anybody could do. And in fact, you may have already found yourself doing it, but not realise that you're actually creating a prototype. The second example is to make use of low or no code tools. Like it or not, I imagine that Gen AI is on most people's minds right now. I know that it's on our Chloe and I's minds. And so we've been recently working together on an internal project. Again, finding ourselves with not a lot of time juggling it in between the gaps of alongside client work. But we were particularly kind of interested in what's known as the advice gap. Essentially, there are a lot of people that would benefit from professional financial advice, but just can't get access to it. What we've learned is that people with large amounts of wealth, they can often afford it, or they get access to free commission-based services. But if your wealth is more modest, these services may not be available, or perhaps even prohibitively expensive. And herein lies the advice gap. And without this advice, it can just generally be a bit harder to make good choices about how you save your money, where you might invest, or how you might plan for retirement. And so we wanted to explore the role that Gen AI could play in this space and the impact it could have when providing advice about your pension and providing some guidance about your pension. And so, using OpenAI's custom GPT feature, we created an experience in a way that requires no code or technical skills as such. And we did this by simply creating a set of instructions of how we wanted this chatbot that we were defining, how we wanted it to behave, and what we wanted it to be able to do in certain situations. And actually, OpenAI have intentionally made this process kind of extremely easy to use. So within just a couple of days, we defined how we wanted what we called pension bot to act and how we wanted it to behave. And we now have this live interactive prototype that we could use to test firsthand with people, really to better understand the effectiveness of addressing the advice gap. And so, following on that kind of similar thread of AI, there's lots of new tools coming out with AI kind of plugged into the tool and that workflow. And I guess we really need to find ways to, lean into these new AI tools when it feels appropriate to, of course, but to figure out, when it feels appropriate to help kind of accelerate our process of creating prototypes. So this particular example from Figma's latest release, it does just that. And I'm sure we've probably all kind of experienced moments where we're feeling tight for time, or even just kind of struggling to get that first idea down on paper. And so with the help of Gen AI here, it can really just kind of give you that head start. It can provide you a little bit of inspiration, or even kind of form the foundation for that first idea to build on, or even just kind of help you to populate your prototype with some relevant content without having to kind of spend hours kind of trawling through Google trying to find the kind of perfect image to use in your prototype. And so, before you know it, you've got a kind of a prototype that represents exactly what it is that you want to be able to test. And then lastly, this example really shows how you can bring some of these different techniques together. For example, by combining guerrilla-based testing with paper prototypes. And so we've previously worked with a Bristol-based bus company, and they were looking at ways in which they could reduce journey times and explore the concept of pre-purchase tickets. Again, the kind of project was up against the familiar tight timescales, and so we created a bunch of paper prototypes, and then we based ourselves at busy bus stops to test our ideas with people. The sheets of paper that you can see my colleague Anna holding up are mimicking different screens, and they're held up against this kind of big cardboard box that represents a new digital ticket booth. And doing this really kind of enabled us to understand current passenger behaviours in context, and really start to identify what perhaps future behaviours might look like when passengers are going about kind of pre-purchasing their ticket. But I guess kind of most importantly, it really helped us to save time on participant recruitment, because we based ourselves at different bus stops around the city to make sure that we had kind of good representation of the different types of passengers using the bus service. It sped up that process, and it also just provided this space for much richer conversations about the ideas, because we were kind of in that context that they were being used. Even if Anna does have a GoPro strapped to her chest. And so, yeah, hopefully each of these examples then have shown kind of some of the different ways that you can really make sure that you do have enough time. And so our top tips for when time is a little tight is to, yeah, kind of think about what are the kind of simple, rapid prototyping techniques that you could use, like just scribbling things down on a sheet of paper. Where it feels appropriate to, where can you use technology to help speed up that workflow? And then lastly, kind of, yeah, thinking differently about how you could test your prototype through the use of guerrilla style participant recruitment.
Cool. So the next excuse that we're going to talk about is we can't invest in this right now. And this is something that we quite often hear. We know that testing designs and prototyping before developing and releasing a service is so much cheaper than having to change things retrospectively once it's been released. But often we hear that there just isn't enough budget in a project or team to do as much prototyping as perhaps we might think is necessary, or to help us to test things that we're not quite certain of. Another thing that could happen is that there's not budget for fancy prototyping tools, or to bring in developers or people with that skill set to build out a few concepts to test. Or it could actually be that there wasn't any budget to set aside for prototyping when they were planning things. So yeah, we wanted to have a think about what we can do about that and how we can change the way that we prototype to overcome that. So the first example is the fact that if you want to avoid having to spend time and money on getting new tools, you can just use tools that you already have. So we worked for a defense organization, and they had such strict security policies that it was just going to take absolutely ages and loads of money to make something like Figma secure. So what we ended up doing was just to use PowerPoint, actually, in this case, to make clickable prototypes. And I actually found out later, really quite annoyingly, that PowerPoint has its own Power Mockup functionality, which helps people to do this. But what I did was we just made ours with slide transitions. We made prototypes with slide transitions, and it actually worked surprisingly well. It did a really good job of mocking up some designs that we wanted to test, but with no budget for Figma or anything like that. And the wider team that we were in had never really used or seen prototypes like this before, because they'd never had access to the tools. So some of the things that we ended up doing really stretched their beliefs of what was possible without a proper developer. And we did it for very little money in comparison, which was fantastic. Another thing that you can do is just to fake it. So it's quite rare that prototypes are ever fully functioning, but if you take it one step further, yeah, it's good just to try and see how you can take that one step further. So one example is we worked with the NHS innovation team to look at whether voice assistants like Alexa or Siri would be a good way for people to do healthcare tasks like ordering prescriptions. So in order to create our initial designs for how the voice assistant would interact with the user, we used a technique called Wizard of Oz, which is my favorite name for a user research technique. And this is basically, for those of you who haven't come across it before, a technique where one person sat in another room and pretended to be the Alexa that the user was speaking to. So you can see that the person on the screen is sat behind this pink screen. And that person uses a script that mimics the way that the Alexa would be programmed to respond. So the person who is testing is able to hear them and sort of talk to them as if they were an Alexa or Siri or voice assistant device. And we learned so much from doing this, and it really enabled us to refine our conversation designs to quite an advanced point before we even got a developer involved, which saved us loads of money and time. So it's a really great way to just try to prototype something that perhaps you might need a developer for. It's a slightly different problem though if no user research or prototype prototyping was budgeted for in the very beginning. So I think if people haven't budgeted for any prototyping and you feel like there's something that you really need to test and squeeze in somehow, it can be really quite difficult, especially if teams aren't mature in the design space or they haven't really seen prototyping or user research in action before. So one way to approach these situations is just to be a bit stealthy and perhaps do a small bit of user research to show your stakeholders the value of testing ideas with users. Essentially, when we were thinking about this, what you're doing is prototyping the idea of prototyping with users, and that's quite meta. But hopefully that makes sense. One example of this is we ran a stealthy side project with a wealth management organization whose UCD team was just really concerned about something that their wider organization wanted to release. So by creating a prototype and testing it just with 5 people, we then created these highlight reels and videos showing the way that users were interacting with and reacted to their idea. And by seeing this video themselves, this really persuaded the organization that they needed to invest in a wider piece of work to prototype and test this thing properly. So actually, if you do this and you stealthily show the impact, especially through video, it can be really powerful. And what you can do is, I think by doing this, gradually people will see the impact of prototyping and make sure that there's budget for it in the future. So hopefully these examples have shown how you can get from we can't invest in this right now to we must invest in this right now. Just to recap those top tips. So instead of using new tools, just try to use tools you already have. Mock up experiences without developing them out fully, like we did when we pretended to be an Alexa instead of getting a developer in. And bring people on the journey to show them the value of prototyping and testing with users so that then they'll make space for that in their budget in the future.
So the third excuse we come across then is we simply can't prototype that. And so perhaps there's a belief then that it'll be too involved to prototype the concept without the use of specialist tools or skills. Or perhaps you're even kind of struggling yourself to kind of find a way to prototype the effect that a whole service might have on its frontline staff and customers. And so, in this context, changing the belief can be quite difficult to overcome. We're often collaborating with organisations that have kind of established products and services where there's lots of people involved, a set process for delivery. And yeah, it can be really tricky in this scenario to kind of introduce a new way of doing things. But we believe there's always a way to experiment with prototyping. And so one of the kind of biggest hurdles that you need to overcome when you hear this excuse is actually to just quickly identify a way that the concept you're exploring can be prototyped. And one of the most effective ways that you can do this is simply by acting it out. Role play can often feel a little intimidating as it takes people out of their comfort zones. I know that it definitely does for me. But sometimes this is exactly what is needed to kind of spark that change in mindset. Getting people to kind of place themselves in the shoes of the users really encourages people to better understand how that experience is going to feel when suddenly they've become the prototype. At our last company conference, we were tasked with thinking about speculative futures for big recognizable brands. And so one of the teams chose to explore what a virtual AI design assistant might look like for IKEA in 3 years' time. And so now, what better way than to use role play to really bring that idea to life that the team were imagining? Within less than an hour, they defined the actors in this new service, quite literally. They'd created a script and they built some simple props to really kind of get a sense of what the interaction would feel like. And so by using this technique, it really brought to life the human impact and the ethical considerations that would need to have kind of front of mind when implementing a new concept like this that kind of leans upon new technology. And without this, it would have been really easy to kind of misunderstand or perhaps even overlook certain elements without really kind of living and feeling that experience, that kind of role play kind of forced everybody together to do. And then, how about if you're planning a new space or a new environment? There can be a tendency here to kind of jump straight into a CAD based design tool and start kind of drawing up how you're imagining that space. But in doing so, would it give you a clear sense of the kind of the best ergonomics for the space, or even kind of how people will interact with one another and flow through that new environment? There's this brilliant film on Netflix at the moment called The Founder, and it depicts the story of the creation of McDonald's. And there's this great scene where the two kind of founding brothers are figuring out the best way to structure and organize the kitchen setup for their first restaurant, where they want to be able to kind of reach their goal of being able to cook a hamburger in 30 seconds. And so they needed to kind of figure out, where are we going to serve our customers, and where are we going to grill and cook the burgers, and where are we going to kind of put everything together before we then hand it over to the customer. And so instead of jumping into a kind of more typical design tool, they took to a tennis court, and it was on the tennis court where they then prototyped that perfect kitchen environment, kind of marking out the exact size, the exact layout of all of those kind of essential elements, but also all of the different people that would be working within that kitchen. And in doing so, it enabled them to find a way to create the most efficient layout for their first kitchen, um, and enabling them to hit that goal of cooking and serving a burger in 30 seconds. It's it's a really great film. Definitely worth taking a look. So, what are our top tips then when there's this belief that you can't prototype something? So, I guess what we would be saying is bring people into that process, put them in the shoes of the users, get them kind of out of their comfort zones, and encourage them to become the prototype. Make it physical and interactive, and even kind of lean on simple props to really kind of bring it to life a little bit more, but making sure that you can kind of keep it iterative and making it as real as possible. And then define the roles and behaviors of the actors in the service, and then act it out, see how it feels, and then kind of spot the opportunities that exist to make it even better.
Cool. So we're on to our last scenario. And the last one that we wanted to talk about was we already know what we want to do. This comes up a lot when people have full confidence in their idea. They want to go straight ahead and develop something without testing it. And often what we see is that often prototyping is framed as something that people should do so that we can fail faster. But for people who are who are really attached to an idea, the concept that this idea could fail is really quite quite unpalatable. Maybe comes across as quite combative, so they want to just sort of like say, no, we just want to carry on, even if it's not meant in that way. Otherwise, people might have already started developing, so it might feel too late to be prototyping at this point because you're not in the sort of earlier alpha or beta stages. So yeah, people just sort of want to plow ahead and just crack on with something despite the uncertainty. So what can you do about it? If they've started developing already, it can feel a little bit like a lost cause. And it was definitely the case when we were working with a particular defence team. There was a whole team of developers working their way through this big backlog of ideas. And because they'd never really worked with service designers or UX or user research teams before, or they'd never really worked in the discovery alpha beta way of working either, what they were doing was planning on testing these ideas once they'd been developed and essentially skipping that initial user research phase and heading straight into beta. So what we had to do was basically work by stealth again and intercept the backlog, which you can see a lovely Jira backlog on the screen. And by checking out the backlog, what we would do is we prototyped and tested small user stories before they were developed. And this was really good because from the point where we came in, all of the things that people were developing had also been prototyped. And it meant that there was no impact on the development timescales or the activities themselves, but it did reduce the load when it came to beta testing because we've caught a lot of the initial issues before it had gone into the development itself. It's slightly different if people have started developing, or if they haven't started developing, sorry, but they want to crack on and make an idea without prototyping. I think it's actually more of a mindset shift that you need to try and push. So coming back to the idea that people are sort of put off prototyping because it's framed as failing fast. Yeah, it's really about reframing it. So it's more about learning rather than failing. A good example of this is when we worked with a company on a dashboard that they had, and there were loads of different teams all working on loads of different ideas that they were trying to make, and they were just really excited about these ideas, which was fantastic, but they just had zero alignment between them. Prototyping in this instance was really clearly the way that we wanted to go to help gain that alignment. If you'd have told them that they wanted to see if their idea was going to fail, it would have immediately switched them off from that process and from prototyping. So what we did instead was we prototyped all of the ideas and framed the activity as fast learning, just to see which ideas worked best and which would form together a great dashboard. And this was way more palatable. And we found that by talking about prototyping as learning fast, it really helped to get people on board instead. So moving on then to one slightly more radical thing. So when people just want to build things, what you can do is you can sort of start to use provocatypes. And provocatypes, or prototypes as they're sometimes known, are things that represent the vision of a possible future world. So it could be an artifact from that world or artifacts that allow an audience to experience a part of that world. And it's often used to model the impact of a concept on the environment or society. So in this example that you can see on the screen, an agency called Superflux created scents that allowed the United Arab Emirates government to smell what their cities would smell like if they continued to burn fossil fuels in the way that they currently are. So actually, just coming back to the point that how this links back to helping people that already know what they want to do. If you go in with this positive approach and imagine that their idea exists, what you can do is use provocatyping to think about what the future would be like with this world in it, whether that's good or bad. So making a scent probably feels quite way out of the realm of possible things that we can do as service designers, but it really doesn't need to be that hard. At CX Partners, we did this provocatyping activity that looked at the impact of self-driving cars. And we perhaps thought that perhaps a consequence could be that to make things safer, eventually there would be roads where only self-driving cars could go. So we created this Google Maps prototype, which you can see on the screen, which showed how if you don't have a self-driving car, which you can see on the left-hand side, it would take you ages to get to places on a much less direct route. But if you do have a self-driving car, perhaps you would be able to just zip straight through the center of town, which you could see on the right-hand side. There was a talk that one of our colleagues, Fion, has done recently as well around using provocatypes to shape policy around school-aged childcare as well, which was really cool. But bringing this back though, by modeling the future consequences, it really encourages people to consider how they're designing things now. And it's also a really cool way to get people excited and interested in prototyping. So let's summarize how we can approach the situation where people know what to do and don't know how to test it. First of all, if the solution is already being developed, intercept the backlog, look at the things that haven't been developed yet and do small prototypes and tests on those. If people are raring to go and don't want prototyping to get in the way or stop them, have a think about the framing of prototyping and emphasize that it's a way to learn fast and reduce risk so it's more successful when it goes live. And then finally, introduce provocatyping. And by keeping that open mind and assuming that the product exists, try to think about ways that you can adapt the product now to make them more resilient and sustainable in the future.
So the aim of this talk then was really to try and kind of push the boundaries a little bit about kind of when and how you can use prototyping and actually demonstrate ways in which you can rethink your approach so that it's not always a thing that's done in alpha or in beta. So that it's not always done by a designer or that it's not prevented by any of the excuses that we've shared today. So as we kind of start to bring our talk to a close, we wanted to leave you with a handful of principles that you could adopt to help kind of creating more impact when you're thinking about prototyping. So principle 1, start now. Often the hardest thing can be just getting started, whether that's a new fitness regime, whether that's starting a new business, or perhaps, a new way of doing something. But often when we've kind of built up that courage that it takes to break through that initial resistance that we might be feeling, we often then discover that the following steps feel like they just come much more naturally to us. And so what we'd be saying here is to just do something. Don't get caught up trying to persuade people with words alone, and don't wait for what feels like the perfect point within the design process, because it can always be a good thing to be creating a prototype, because really what you're doing is encouraging further learning.
The second principle is to find small and easy ways to test big things. So rather than investing a lot of time, energy, and resources, what it's about really is creating it just enough to learn and get really comfortable with the idea that you can throw away the prototype, because the value is more about the outcome and the learning, not necessarily the thing. So don't worry about your background or the tools you have or your skill set. Just try and make something.
Principle 3, change the narrative. So I think as Chloe's touched on already, we might be kind of relatively familiar with the expression fast failing. So let's continue to work together to change that narrative to fast learning. And if we're able to do this, it really kind of brings things back to one of the original values associated with prototyping, which is about experimentation. And with any form of experimentation, we recognize that failure is just an important part of that learning process. And what we also know is that the leading people-centric organizations just demonstrate behaviors like experimentation and learning on a day-to-day basis. They're really just kind of seen as the norm.
Finally, the last principle is just to involve people throughout and make it fun. So invite people to watch user research sessions or get them to create prototypes themselves or be involved in the role play that Sam was talking about. I think ultimately, the more collaborative you can be, the more likely you'll be able to convince people of the importance of prototyping and making the changes that you suggest as well, which is really important. Um, but also make it fun for people to get involved so that they want to do it more as well. And if you make it more experimental and explorative, you just keep that curiosity and that positive attitude that is really important. So let's go over those principles again. So start now, find small ways to test big things, change the narrative, and also involve people throughout. And if you keep these in mind throughout your work, it's just a really great way to push the boundaries of what we think prototyping is and to squeeze in prototyping so we're testing things when it matters. And it's also really one of the best ways to keep an eye on the user and to make sure you're always being as user-centric as possible. So I think that's the end of our talk. We've got a few minutes now to hear from you a little bit and to answer any questions. So if you have any questions, thoughts, or ideas, feel free to pop them in the Slido chat. There doesn't need to be a question, just feel free to pop anything in there. And we'd really love to hear what you think about this question that we've got on the screen. So how could you prototype one of the challenges that you're facing right now, if you fancy sharing that? Yeah, it'd just be really nice to see if anyone has any ideas, really. So should we open it up to questions, Amanda? I don't know if
Yes,
anything has come through.
thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam and Chloe. Really lovely talking. We've had some questions on the go while you've been chatting. So I'm going to go from those that have had some people, more than one people have voted for these questions. So they're at the top of my screen. So the first one is, how do you decide which prototype technique to use?
Sam, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a couple of things that kind of crop up actually. So I guess the first thing to be thinking about is, yeah, how much time do you have? Are you kind of right up against a deadline and just kind of need to get something out super quickly? I guess the other thing that's on my mind is probably around looking at the kind of capabilities and tools that you've got kind of at your disposal within your kind of immediate team, and how that might kind of influence your decision. But probably the most important thing is probably just thinking about what it is that you need to learn, and thinking about what those kind of learning objectives are. As I guess we've sort of touched on throughout the whole talk, really, prototyping is really just a tool to enable better learning, really. And so if you can learn something by simply writing it down on a piece of paper and putting it in front of stakeholders or putting it in front of your user base, then do that and give that a try. I think that's probably what I would suggest. Chloe, is there anything that you would add or build on with that?
I think the only thing that's sort of springing to mind at the moment, probably because I've been having a lot of conversations about it, is think about the fidelity that you're prototyping in as well. So I think only prototype the things that you want to answer your question, so that people don't get caught up in the like minute details like you were talking about earlier, Sam. So if you actually think about what research question you've got and bring it right back so that people can only focus on those parts, then that's really helpful as well. When you're thinking about like how to prototype or what prototyping technique to use.
Thanks, Sam and Chloe. So the next question, I got a few votes, is how do you help manage expectations with showing participants prototypes for feedback?
Oh, that's interesting.
Oh, go on, Chloe. Go for it. Go.
Go on, Sam, you go.
I was just going to say to just state expectations from the start. Actually, say it's a prototype, and then almost kind of use that to your advantage to use it as an opportunity to co-design the experience that you're trying to create. If people have kind of got this sense that they're looking at something that is kind of in the works, often what we see is that people are kind of more open to collaborating and building upon the idea that you've got, rather than seeing it as a polished piece of art, if you like. And so kind of stating expectations up front that, hey, we're just going to look at a prototype today and we'd love to hear your feedback, often just creates this kind of really lovely open environment where you can start to co-design and build upon what it is that you've already got. But Chloe, go for it.
Oh, that's exactly what I was going to say, really. I think I've been toying a lot with the idea of like talking to users about a prototype and if they actually understand what that means. And I think that actually if you sort of frame it as like, we've got some ideas of how this service might look, we want to get your feedback on it. Hopefully that should set ideas. And if you show them something that's really polished, It feels like that's like the final product. Whereas if you say like, oh, we've got some ideas and it's like a work in progress, then actually it's quite a nice way of to sort of set expectations quite well. Yeah, it's quite a challenging one though, because when you're showing people something that they, especially if they feel passionately about it as a user, they want it to be perfect, and when something isn't quite perfect, it's yeah, it can be quite difficult for them. But it's a really interesting question.
Great, lovely, thank you. And this is, I guess, the other side of the coin. On the point of leaders, quote unquote, not letting go of an idea, what if the prototype shows kind of a mixed or negative response to the concept, but the leader still doesn't want to let it go?
That is such a difficult time. I think when people have been really like, oh, this is like my baby, this is my idea that I really want to continue with, it's I think it's about if something doesn't work, like showing them videos, like getting them to really like see people's reactions can be really powerful, because if you're just there being like, oh, people didn't like it, or like giving quotes, sometimes it doesn't even bring it to life as much because they put so much time and effort into it. It could be that they're really struggling to let things go. Otherwise, I think going into it with like a positive frame of mind, saying, okay, well, yeah, let's go ahead with this, but how could we like help do something to fix the issues that people are coming up against. So it's like a yes and sort of approach can really help. And eventually, if you sort of like get onto their side of the table and like work through it with them, I think ultimately, if you're looking at the ultimate goal that you're trying to achieve and saying, okay, well, we both want to reach this goal, how are we going to get there, and working through things with them, sometimes it's just helping them to get from their state of mind into the state of mind that you're in, and sort of going through that sort of like coaching process with them, which can be really time consuming, but it's often very important for later on down the line. Sam, I don't know if you've got anything else or any other experiences that you've had that you would you'd like to share.
I mean, yeah, the immediate thing that comes to mind is exactly what you said, is kind of bring that stakeholder into the user research and get them to kind of see firsthand what it is people are saying when they're looking at that prototype. I guess the second thing that kind of comes to mind is if they're particularly kind of wedded to a thing, can you also prototype an alternative that the team perhaps believes could address the user's goal in a slightly different way, and to then test that as well? And then you've got kind of two comparative ideas essentially, and perhaps just kind of showing maybe a fairly tricksy stakeholder with a big opinion about a thing, that there is a different way, but use prototyping again to your advantage by not investing too much time in creating that prototype. Think about what's the small thing that we can do to test that big idea. And so, yeah, maybe just that act of showing a different way and bringing that stakeholder along on the journey might kind of help to open their eyes to, a different way of doing something, a different way of tackling that problem.
Yeah, I'm doing
Well,
exactly that on my project at the moment. I'm doing 2
Right.
prototypes. Yeah.
Thank you both. Unfortunately, we still have 4 questions left, but not enough time to get to all of them. So thank you everyone who attended and participated and asked a question that we weren't able to get to, but we are right at time now. Please give Sam and Chloe a big hand, and thanks for all of your engagement, and looking forward to seeing you all at our next Lunch and Learn.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Nice one. Thanks, guys.